Welcome to this first presentation on the SARI webinar series, knowledge series, which we started. We've started from today. We have very eminent presenters today from National Renewable Energy Laboratory of the US. Where they'll be talking about energy storage in South Asia, regulatory, technical, and economic considerations. So what I'll do, I'll start with setting the context of this for about 10 minutes. And after that, I'll hand over to David Palchak and his team for taking you through the main presentation. As all of you know, energy storage is gaining more and more importance. Not only are the prices reducing because of the increased interest and usage of energy storage, it's going to play a major role in the future. As you know, we have most of the things are being dictated by environmental considerations. And so all countries are going for more and more of renewable energy, which is basically solar and wind. And these being intermittent, you require energy storage to a large extent to store energy when there is excess of wind and solar, and to generate or to give back this energy to the grid when these go down. So with this brief thing, I'll just take you through my presentation, which is just setting the context so that you appreciate the type of fluctuations that you have in wind and solar, and some international examples which have taken a lot of interest in setting up this storage. So should we go through the presentation? Can you move to the next slide? Yeah. So this is courtesy POSOCO, which is the power system operation company in India, the system operator, where I have requested for a typical daily curve of solar and wind, and this is region wise. So if you see, there are three main regions, which is Western, Southern, and Northern, which have renewable energy. And then you have the total of all these three. So if you see that there are fluctuations in the solar curve because of the monsoon season, where you have clouds. And the lowest one is the Western region, which is after that you have the Northern region. And then you have the Southern region, and then you have the total generation. So the totaling of the generation evens out some of the intermittencies, but there still are. And of course, solar is when you would have no generation during the night times. So zero generation after mostly 18 hours at this season. Let's go to the next one. Let's see the wind variation. Now, this is the wind variation for a typical day of 24 hours. And here you see wind in three regions, which is again the renewable rich regions. That's Northern region is the lowest. And after that, you have Southern region wind, and then you have Western region. And of course, this one is in thousands of megawatts, similarly with solar. And if you total up, so you're having around, at the peak, you have 14,000 megawatts of wind during around 17 hours. So if you see, this is quite like the load curve that we have. Not exactly, it's shifted a little bit. So you normally have the peak generation close to 18 or 19 hours of the day, the all India generation, the demand. And you have peak generation from wind coming during around 16 to 17 hours. So it's like, but it's the shape is more or less in line with the load curve, and so it's beneficial for the country, and of course the system operator, easier for them. Let's go to the next one. Now, this is combining the All India wind and solar generation. So the total of wind and the total of solar is combined for the full country. So the one which is the hump is the All India solar generation. The one which is fluctuating, the light green one is All India wind, and the total renewable generation. So if you combine the solar and wind, you have a peak coming around 13 hours, according to this, which is around 30,000 megawatts during this season. This is April to September is the high wind season, and you have the maximum wind generation during this time. Solar is not the peak season at this time because you have clouds. So solar generation mostly peaks in around January or during the non-cloudy season. Let's go to the next one. So this gives you an idea of the intermittencies of generation. I took one of a particular state, which is yesterday, 24th August. And here again, here if you see the solar is quite less because of the clouds, that's the bottom curve. Then you have hourly wind generation and the total of both wind and solar, which is the green curve on top. So the installed capacity of wind in Gujarat is 7,623, but it's generating at a peak around 3,600 megawatts. Whereas solar generation is 6,000 and is generating less than 500 megawatts. That's because of the monsoon season that we have, a lot of clouds. But during the non-monsoon season, you'll have this much higher. Let's go to the next one. Now, this is just to give you a seasonal variation of in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is a renewable-rich state, which has got one of the highest wind generation in the country. So, if you see wind generation, how it fluctuates over the seasons, over different months of the year. So, it peaks, as you can see, in sometime in August to September. Or there's also between June and July. That's the time it peaks. These are for different years, starting from 2010-11 to 2016-17. But during the November to March season, there is not too much wind, and that's the time when you have more of solar. So it's sort of complementary. This is just to give you see how it fluctuates over the seasons. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, so what we did now is try to see how in Tamil Nadu we could use battery. This is a wind farm, which is Ayanathur, a pooling station. So it's got a pooling station with the number of where number of wind generators come pool their energy. So if you see the red portion now, what I wanted to show you that the red portion is without curtailment. This wind was curtailed because of a number of financial implications that the state has to suffer when you have intermittent generation. So you may have overloading of some lines. You have to pay the deviation settlement charges, which is the charges where you go beyond the schedule. So the one which is the blue one below is where the actual generation was. So if they had not curtailed, the red one would have been there. So we put a battery which is of a 10 megawatt battery rating, lithium-ion battery with 40 megawatt hour, which means 10 megawatt for 4 hours. And we took the efficient. This is actually is accurately simulated. Or battery operation, as well as the wind generation. Assuming that has an efficiency, round trip efficiency of 85%, a depth of discharge of 80%. We've used these figures, and the yellow one is where we've tried to flatten the curve of this fluctuation. So if you see, we flattened it in between for some hours, and then got more in line with when the peak occurs. And the green curve at the bottom is how the battery, the 10 megawatt battery, how it's how it's at what megawatt it's discharging. So right at the top it is charging. So 0 above 10 it's charging, and then when uh, sorry, I'm sorry, it is giving, and when there's high wind generation, it starts charging. So it starts going below, and then it starts again giving during the uh, evening. After it's got charged, it starts again giving during the latter part of the day. Now this is for a 10 megawatt battery of 4 hours, 40 megawatt hour. Let's go to the next one. Now this is, we've doubled the capacity. No, not this. Yeah,
Oh,
this
yeah.
We've doubled the capacity of the battery from 10 megawatt to 20 megawatt and 4 hours. 4 hours. So it's 20 into 4, 80 megawatt hour, and using the same efficiency and depth of discharge. And the same notation. The red is the uncurtailed generation, which would have come if we not curtailed. But the blue one is where we've curtailed the generation. And we've actually converted this. The yellow is the actual output of that farm then, because it takes in when you have more generation, and then gives out the battery gives out when the peak comes, and the generation is less. So you can see that it's converted this wind plus battery into almost like a peaking station, which peaks around 20 hours if you see that the yellow one. So this is a method of trying to follow the load curve the way it is, because that's what system operators want, and the battery helps. What we've used here is a battery. Of course, we are technology agnostic. It could be any storage, any type of storage. You have pump storage, which is the majority of storage in the world, as well as in India. But we took the case of a battery, which is to show how a lithium-ion battery would be used. Let's go to the next one. Yeah. Now, UK in 2016 called for enhanced bids for enhanced frequency response, where it was technology agnostic, and they said that anyone who can deliver, who can respond in 0.5 seconds, in half a second, to fluctuations, whenever the output is required, within half a second, it should be able to deliver, and it should respond. And in the next 0.5 second, that means within 1 second, it should give the full output. So that's the sort of tender which was floated, and most of the ones which most of the people who bid were battery assets, and there's 64 sites, which were 64 unique sites. 61 were for this technology, and 2 were for demand reduction, and 1 was for thermal generation. Let's go to the next one. These are the winning bidders. EDF Energy Renewables got the maximum at 40 megawatt battery, and you can see this. And contracts were awarded on a 4-year term, so that it would give providers the certainty that they need to develop the technology. And of course, the payment was made not only for the capacity, as well as for operating usage, depending on the usage. So 2-part bid. Let's go to the next one. So some of these are some dates of 15 July. It was bid out 2016, and there were 37 providers. And of course, the UK was paying money in any case to deal with this with these fluctuations as well as peaking. So they were able to actually save, and the consumer saved about $200 million per annum in investment in battery plus solar PV. Potential cost saving would be that much, right? Okay, and so I won't go into these details. These are you can see this at your leisure. Let's go to the next one. This is the other big one, which is a 100 megawatt battery in Australia, South Australia, where we had an incident where because of hurricane or storm, people in the houses didn't get electricity for it was disrupted badly for quite a long time, for many days. So the immediate cure was to try to balance, because there were a lot of people who were going for wind generation, but wind generation there were some issues of storm having affecting these, and therefore what was urgently required was storage, and the quickest to build was a battery, and therefore Tesla said that it would complete this whole process in 100 days. A 100 megawatt battery and 134, I think, megawatt hour or 129 megawatt hour of is the energy capacity, and they did do it within 100 days. And later, there was, so 70 megawatt was dedicated to providing services for the grid and the South Australian government, and for 30 megawatt they could participate in the national electricity market of Australia. And recently in 2019, also they helped when a tornado in late January pulled down a connector between South Australia and Victoria, and South Australia is islanded, so they helped in that. Let's go to the next one. I think that's I thought I'll give you a broad overview of storage, how it can help, and some international examples, and you get a feel of how the generation from wind and solar fluctuates. Thank you. I now request David and his team to upload their presentation and make this presentation, their presentation of NREL, which is actually the main presentation for today. Sharmishta, you'll have to take this down, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Batra. So I believe I'm sharing my screen at this point. Does everything look okay?
No, David, I haven't got a screen. I don't know about the others, but I'm not able to see your screen.
But I can see it. I think the others can also see it.
I see. Okay.
Yes,
Now I can see it. Yes, I can see it now. That's right. Yes. Right. Okay. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for setting the context for this conversation today. And thank you to Arade for inviting us to be part of this webinar series. We're very excited to talk about a project we're undertaking to understand energy storage in South Asia. More specifically, understanding the role of the grid-connected energy storage in South Asia's power sector transformation. So I'm from the National Renewable Energy Lab, as Mr. Batra said. It's a US government-funded laboratory where we look at, we're focused on clean energy, all the way from questions of material science, all the way to some of the integration questions that we're going to talk about today. So this is, these are the folks that you'll hear from today. I'm David, I'll start off, and we have a number of different parts of this project, and my colleagues will be joining us to talk about the specifics of those. So for our agenda, I'm going to give a brief overview of NREL's work in South Asia that is relevant to work today. I'm not going to go over everything, but we have a number of things that we've built on over the last many years that we've been working in the region that are allowing us to ask some really interesting questions about energy storage. I'll give a little bit of context about energy storage potential, although Mr. Batra covered a number of the important points, so I won't spend too much time on that. Amy will talk about policy and regulatory considerations for energy storage. Obviously, a key part of a potentially changing or new technology. And Ilya and Mohit will talk about the technical and economic potential for energy storage. That's what many of South Asia stakeholders probably understand us for is we do a lot of modeling of the techno-economics. So we'll talk about our plans for that, conclusions, and there hopefully we'll have time for a few questions at the end. Okay, so our South Asia program is largely focused around power systems. Starting off with our Greening the Grid study. So in the green box, we did a study that was published, a large study published in 2017 with USAID and the Ministry of Power. And we looked at very detailed operations of the system for 2022, essentially when India meets 175 gigawatt target for renewable energy. And so this was looking at 15-minute operations of the power system of India with high levels of renewable energy. So looking into the future, trying to understand what are the challenges going to be and how can we cost effectively manage them. One of the main conclusions is that the grid can balance without any drastic changes to technology. And certainly there are ways to make it more efficient, but ultimately the grid could balance. So that was a really good outcome. One of the tools that we are bringing into this study essentially started with Greening the Grid, and that's a detailed operations model of India. And this contains essentially all the assets on the grid, generators, transmission. We put a lot of detail into the renewable energy as well, which is why we needed to create high fidelity weather data. And so that allows us to understand the geographic and the time varying expectations for renewable energy generation. And so those two pieces, an operations model and very detailed weather data for at least 1 year, are two pieces that we're carrying into our study that we'll talk about today. From the Greening the Grid study, we moved on to looking at some regional questions, and specifically cross-border electricity trade in the region. So this was looking at India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is a little less relevant to today's conversation, but regardless, out of this, we needed to build detailed models of Nepal and Bangladesh, and also give a little more attention to Bhutan to be able to build a South Asia model where we could do detailed operations of cross-border electricity trade in the region. And what we found when varying the amount of renewable energy or the amount of hydro capacity in Nepal, or varying some of the market interactions between the countries, is that increased trade has regional and individual country benefits. And this varies a lot depending on the amount of coordination between the countries, but certainly there are benefits to increasing trade across those country lines. We also found that as you increase renewable energy capacity, that could increase the opportunities for electricity trade. Specifically, Nepal hydro could have a very large effect on how renewable energy is used around India, and potentially complement that. So as I said, out of this, we were able to build a South Asia region, a detailed operations model of the whole region. And so that's something we're going to be using for our energy storage analysis. In addition, we also did a number of regulatory roadmaps for Nepal, Bangladesh, and India to help realize the benefits of cross-border energy trade, and potentially what would be needed by individual countries to be able to have all those benefits from the trade. So that's a little less relevant from today, but ultimately this was a study that we're able to build on to be able to look at energy storage for the region. In the last box, in planning and operations studies, so we have a number of ongoing studies now in the region where we're looking at least cost capacity expansion planning in India. So this required us to build a new model to be able to look out farther into the future, look beyond, or look at different potential plans for the region. And we often are still looking at operations. We have done some studies of 2030, but as everybody in the region knows, the targets are changing fast. And ultimately, some of these tools will really help deal with things that are changing in that way, and that we can ask new questions of the tools once they're built. They might take a couple years to build really good models, but once they're built, it's more about making modifications, and that's a much more manageable problem, and part of the reason that we can start digging into the energy storage questions without having to go back and build really big power system models. We're also working with India states to plan for high renewable energy futures, and we're using our suite of models to do that as well. Okay, so that was just an overview of our work. I'm going to jump into the energy storage work now and provide a little context, although I will try not to overlap with Mr. Batra too much. Okay, so it's kind of a question of why is there so much attention toward energy storage right now? And this is a picture of an old pumped hydro plant not far from us in Colorado. It was built in the earliest 20th century. And so these technologies have been along for a very long time. But why is there so much attention towards what these technologies can do and potentially building on them into the future? So one point that Mr. Batra covered quite well is that grids are transforming to higher levels of RE. This is happening globally and certainly in the South Asia region. Here's an example from our Greening the Grid study. In the bottom left, we have the load and the net load. So essentially the load is the demand on the system. The net load is the load minus the wind and solar. So what we end up with is a slightly more curvy line to be followed by operators. And this was pointed out by Mr. Batra. As you have wind and solar on the system, that can provide challenges because you want to use all of the wind and solar when it's generated because it is quite inexpensive. But the orange line is going to be a little bit more challenging for operators to help balance supply and demand. So what you see at the right is a result of our Greening the Grid study where we saw pumped storage operations change slightly based on these higher RE scenarios. So in the gray line is essentially what you see for following the load. So our base scenario, there's very little RE in that scenario. Pumped hydro is generating, so when it's above zero, it's generating electricity. When it's below zero, it's pumping or it's absorbing electricity from the grid. So in the gray line, what you see is that pumped hydro is helping during the peak hours in the evening and in the morning when people are getting up in the morning, and it's pumping during the middle of the night when electricity is less expensive or costs are low. When we move to a high RE scenario, we see that there's more dramatic peaks from pumped hydro operation. We see it generating during the peaks at a much higher rate and charging during the middle of the day. So that is when we have a lot of solar online. So wind and solar at the same time, but a lot of solar online. So the pumped hydro is able to charge off of that solar and help to meet the peaks for the system. And so this was looking at a scenario with 22% generation from wind and solar. So essentially in the next 2 years, India expects to meet around that goal. And so this is the sort of operation that you could see from pumped hydro helping to provide flexibility for the grid. However, things are continuing to transform, and what you are looking at for 2030 plans from Central Electricity Authority is over 30% renewable energy. So these trends in the net load and dealing with these more curvy lines from an operator perspective, this is going to continue and this is going to get a little bit more dramatic. The other reason that there's so much attention around energy storage right now is that costs of batteries are dropping. So on the left here, we have Bloomberg numbers for the costs between 2010 and 2018. And in 8 years, this was an 85% drop in cost of lithium-ion batteries. And so this is the technology that's sort of leading the way in new technologies coming online to be used as energy storage. In the right graph, what you see is the growth in energy storage globally during this period, actually going all the way back to 2000. So there's a number of technologies in this graph, and some of them you see leveling off. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but the most dramatic piece of information on this is in the blue, where you see the lithium-ion battery starting around 2010, we see lithium-ion batteries start to grow, and they've grown dramatically in the last 10 years, based largely on these declining costs and the ability of batteries to compete with other assets on the grid that do similar things like generators or transmission. So the other reason that energy storage is such an exciting technology for stakeholders is that it has many applications. And I think many of the attendees probably have seen a chart sort of like this, where we see the number of different services that energy storage can provide along the x-axis or the horizontal axis. We see that different timescales, these operate on different timescales. So these are essentially operational timescales. And so I'm just going to go through a few of these. So at the top, we have energy and capacity. Energy arbitrage is the one that most people think of when they think of batteries being able to buy low and sell high. So essentially, as I showed in the pumping storage example, where buying solar energy, which is inexpensive, and selling during peak demand times when the prices for energy would be higher. So being able to make money in that way and help provide flexibility to the grid. So that's kind of the most intuitive way for batteries to be operating. However, there's a number of other things they can do. Resource adequacy is one of these. So that's basically being available when you're really needed. And that's an important part of reliability on the grid. And certainly something that batteries could provide to a utility, or even just consider from a merchant plant perspective in trying to make money. Ancillary services are essentially increasing reliability, and batteries and other, essentially batteries are taking a lot of the attention of being able to service ancillary services. Other pieces of energy storage could potentially provide these services, but the thing about energy storage is it can potentially act very quickly, and so it's proving to be effective at providing ancillary services. Transmission is another one that's a little more tricky to look at, but certainly intuitively this seems like it would make sense, where you could put a battery at one end of a transmission line and potentially decrease congestion on that line by charging or discharging as needed, and even up to the point of deferring a large upgrade, given that investments in transmission tend to be large and expensive. So these opportunities will certainly evolve as grids evolve, and as we saw, grids are certainly evolving around the world. So this is essentially the big question of this study, is how big are the opportunities and what can countries do to realize their benefits? Okay, so just a quick review of what we already know about energy storage. So as we saw, energy storage can increase flexibility of the grid. We also saw that it can complement variable renewable, but new investments are not necessarily needed to integrate large amounts of renewable energy. This is something we found in the Greening the Grid study for India, and that was not a unique finding. Ultimately, a number of other studies around the world about renewable integration found that you don't necessarily need energy storage from a technical perspective. You can balance with the system, what the system already has. So it becomes a question of economics at that point. And certainly there are opportunities that batteries and other storage technologies are exploring right now. And as we saw, energy storage has many potential applications, but the challenge is really to properly value them through regulations and markets. Some of these applications are new for markets to be dealing with, and there's an evolving process in many markets around the world to try and understand the value that these applications are providing and value them properly. The other thing that you'll hear us talk a lot about, a systems level approach. We model the whole power system when we think about energy storage, and that's in part because it's very sensitive to other changes on the grid, such as solar growth or fuel prices. Ultimately, energy storage isn't that valuable by itself. It can't produce energy. And so it is sensitive to other things on the grid, and so it's important to be able to bring in that perspective when we think about the future of energy storage. So I want to put some bounds on this project before going any further. So we're only talking about grid connected energy storage, so essentially utility scale, so greater than 1 megawatt. And that would be interconnected to the bulk power system. So voltages above 100 kilovolts could be down to maybe 33 kilovolts in the sub-transmission level, but ultimately at least above the sub-transmission. We're not talking about residential applications, behind the meter applications. The other piece of this is that we're essentially focused on energy storage that can charge. So hydro reservoir storage is certainly considered, but if it doesn't have a pump on it, we're not focusing our outcomes and our analysis on that piece of the grid. But we will certainly consider it, as I said previously, we take a power systems level approach. So we're trying very hard to understand the flexibility that you can get out of a reservoir storage asset so that we're not overestimating some of the barriers. So our key contributions are essentially divided into two very closely linked pieces. We are going to do an assessment of the existing and potential policy and regulatory barriers, and Amy is going to talk about that in a few minutes. We are also going to do a data-driven analysis on the techno-economics, and so this is where we get into the modeling, and certainly everything we learn about the policy and regulatory environment flows right into this piece of analysis as well. So as I said, our approach is to look at the regulation and the policy and try and help develop a sustainable environment for energy storage. And we're forward looking, so we're not necessarily looking to capture every energy storage tender that goes out in the next few years. What we want to understand are the major drivers behind building an energy storage market. And so we're looking more at the mid and the long-term decisions and trying to look forward a little bit. We're also technology agnostic, so you'll hear us say batteries a lot. That's partly because batteries are kind of leading the charge in terms of energy storage deployments right now, but certainly we're considering any technology. And as far as the regulation and the policy insights, these are applicable to essentially any energy storage technology. And our analysis for the modeling will also be able to integrate some of these other questions about other technologies as well. And we'll probably talk about batteries and pumped hydro, but it will also apply to other potentially disruptive technologies. So here's our timeline for the project. So in a couple months, we'll be publishing an energy storage readiness assessment for India. So this is a regulatory paper on trying to understand where India is in terms of readiness for energy storage from a regulatory and a system perspective. Later this year, you'll see from us some of our modeling and doing capacity expansion modeling of where energy storage might be in the next 10 to 20 years, 10 to 20 to 30 years for the region. And then in the summer, we'll be publishing readiness assessments for Bangladesh and Nepal as well, and digging in more to some of the operational value that you can get to energy storage and trying to understand all those short time frame questions about energy storage. Throughout this process, we want to be engaging policymakers. That's part of the reason we're talking to you today, and we hope you reach out to us with any questions or concerns going forward. And so we want to reach as many power sector stakeholders across the region as possible. So please, if this is interesting to you, or if you have questions or recommendations, we'll certainly happily take those under guidance. So I am going to turn it over to Amy.
All right, thank you, David. Again, my name is Amy Rose. I'm
About
happy to be with
policy
you
and regulatory
today.
considerations.
Thank you, David. As David said, my name is Amy Rose. I'm happy to be with you today. As David mentioned, we're taking a holistic approach to analyzing the potential for storage in South Asia, seeking to understand the technical opportunities and barriers as well as the institutional ones. So this portion of the presentation is focused on those institutional considerations. We'll be highlighting why this new range of energy storage technologies pose unique challenges for policymakers and regulators, how some of these challenges are being addressed in practice, and then finally, I'll outline NREL's approach to evaluating institutional readiness for energy storage in South Asian countries. First, I'm going to provide a little bit of context on the current energy storage landscape to help us think about why this is such a unique grid asset. Storage technologies can provide a wide range of services, as David mentioned, that span generation, transmission, and distribution sectors. This plot shows the range of services that existing utility scale storage projects are designed to provide right now globally. Some of the leading technologies like pump storage, hydro, or lithium-ion batteries are providing energy, they're providing resource adequacy, a range of different ancillary services, and in some cases transmission services as well. And the majority of these projects are listed as being designed to provide multiple services. And a growing area of application is renewable integration, so helping to minimize negative grid impacts of high penetrations of variable generation. And this versatility, the ability for storage facilities to provide services across many different sectors, and at times to do so simultaneously, this presents new questions from a policy and a regulatory perspective on how to identify and how to maximize the value that storage can provide for a particular system. These questions tend to circle around three main areas. The first is, what should we consider storage to be? Since it can provide services across the generation, transmission, and distribution functions, should we consider this to be a generation asset or a transmission asset? Or is there a need to create some new classification of grid assets specific for energy storage? A second related question is, who can be involved in owning and operating energy storage facilities? Structural reforms have resulted in unbundling of competitive and uncompetitive segments of the power sector in many places, and regulations have developed alongside this to govern the types of investments that providers from each segment can make and who's responsible for operating different grid assets. So energy storage, with its ability to provide services across multiple power sector functions, it doesn't fit easily into this regulatory framework. And so we may require updates to existing regulations to allow the sectors that actually benefit from energy storage to make these investments and operate these facilities. And the third question is how storage should be treated in planning and operations. Existing practices weren't really designed to capture the value and the limitations that some energy storage technologies present. For example, in system operations, we now have to think about how do we factor in the state of charge or the duration of a battery in scheduling. For ancillary services, a lot of these services weren't designed to discern the quantity or the quality of the service, like the speed and the accuracy of response that storage can provide. And finally, we have to think about how a technology like a storage facility should be compensated when it's able to provide services that span both cost-based regulated tariffs, but also market-based pricing. And so I want to provide a few examples of how some of these questions are being addressed in practice. The purpose is not to recommend any of these solutions, but rather to highlight the range of approaches that are being tried. On the question of what storage should be, the New York Independent System Operator offers a nice example of creating a new category of grid asset called an energy storage resource that's able to provide multiple services. For instance, a storage project can act as a non-wire transmission deferral project during the summer for a retail utility to help ease congestion, but then it could act as a wholesale market participant during other seasons. On the question of who can own and operate storage, We have an example from Texas where transmission and distribution utilities were barred from legally owning energy storage facilities because they were classified as generation assets. And because of this rule, these utilities couldn't use storage to defer or avoid the need for new network investments. So in 2019, the rule was amended to allow utilities to own energy storage facilities and that sell energy or ancillary services without having to register as a generator. On the question of how storage should be treated, again in the US, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, issued an order that required US markets to reform how they pay providers for frequency regulation. The new payment would include a component that rewards faster ramping resources. And as a result, in the PJM territory, this reform led to a tripling of the fast-moving resources that were available for frequency regulation. What you see on the chart on the top left is the amount of resources available for frequency regulation before and then after this new rule went into place. And because these resources could respond to signals more quickly and more accurately, PJM was able to actually lower the amount of frequency reserves it needed to hold, which is what you see in the chart on the top right. Also, going back to Texas, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT market, is now trying to expand its requirements for ancillary services to lay out specific requirements for fast responding assets. And these changes would address the gap I mentioned earlier that many system requirements don't adequately discern the quality of service. So the benefits of these proposed changes, which are presented in the box on the bottom right, would include improved reliability and flexibility, but also reducing the total amount of reserve capacity that ERCOT would need to procure. So NREL's approach to thinking about the potential for energy storage in South Asia is really driven by a central question of what enables energy storage deployment and operation. Because if we can answer this question from a policy or a regulatory perspective, then we have the building blocks for the policy and regulatory measures that need to be in place for successful deployment of energy storage. And in answering this question, we've developed what we're calling an energy storage readiness assessment. This assessment is comprised of 20 criteria consisting of technical system characteristics, policy criteria, and regulatory criteria. All of these contribute to enabling energy storage deployment, but the absence of any of these doesn't preclude storage investments. The system characteristics are designed to capture the technical aspects that qualitatively describe the power system, such as the load shape, adequacy and capacity and ancillary services, utilization of the transmission network. So these criteria identify issues that commonly afflict rapidly changing grids, where storage could contribute to the solution. In other words, this is a first pass at identifying whether there's a technical or an economic need for utility scale energy storage in a particular system. The policy criteria cover the set of guidelines that direct the scope and the scale of a storage deployment. These topics span early stage exploration into the feasibility of integrating storage onto a grid through establishing deployment targets and support programs to grow a storage industry. So the goal of all of these activities is to accelerate the identification and the implementation of the appropriate storage solutions. The regulatory criteria capture the set of rules necessary to define how storage should be treated. These include rules about ownership and planning, as well as operational practices, tariffs, and safety standards. And the regulation should enable storage to compete on a non-discriminatory basis with other grid assets to provide services and then be compensated for those services. So to use this assessment, each criteria receives a color-based grade shown on the bottom, indicating if current conditions in a particular system or jurisdiction support, prevent, or have no impact on energy storage investments and operation. And the goal of this readiness assessment is to allow policymakers and regulators to quickly gauge how well are our existing frameworks supporting storage investments and operation. The assessment is designed to help them identify priority areas for focus as they continue to develop the appropriate suite of policies, programs, and regulations around energy storage. And it's designed to be applied in any jurisdiction, regardless of its governance, regulatory, or market structure. The readiness assessment is not designed to recommend specific policy or regulatory solutions. It's also not designed to inform whether storage is the best solution among a range of other technical or non-technical interventions that could be used to meet system needs. So we will be applying the readiness assessment in individual countries in South Asia, beginning with India, and developing country-specific reports to help inform the broader dialogue that's already underway around designing institutional frameworks for storage. And a key part of this work will be engaging with policymakers and regulators in the region to ensure we're accurately representing the current conditions in the system and that the results provide some actionable insights that they can use. The other parallel work that we have on storage, which David mentioned, is identifying the technical and economic opportunities for storage through advanced modeling. So I'll let my colleague Ilya describe our modeling work. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. And hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you today. Thanks for joining us. So my name is Ilya. I work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory with Amy and David and Mohit. And so this part of the presentation will focus on how we evaluate the technical and economic potential for energy storage in South Asia. I'll be talking about the challenges of valuing energy storage services, particularly the challenges related to modeling those services in the traditional power system models that we use. I'll be talking about the modeling tools and new features that we're developing to address those challenges in the power systems of South Asia. And then I'll focus on the scenario-based approach that we're using, which is going to enable us to look at the impacts of different policies and regulations that Amy discussed in the previous slides. So the key question for our modeling efforts is to understand what are the drivers for energy storage in South Asia. So both the investment potential and also the operational values, which both impact the drivers and the deployment of storage in South Asia. So in other words, the goal is to understand where, when, and how much energy storage is cost effective, and to inform the policies that enable that cost effective storage deployment. So in order to understand those drivers and to answer the different questions about energy storage, we use integrated models. So this slide shows the two primary model tools that we're using to understand those drivers. First, we use capacity expansion planning. So that's depicted in the top half of the slide. We use it to understand where and when energy storage will be cost effective. And importantly, this provides us insights into the drivers of storage in the context of the whole power system. So this way we can understand the way that changing technology costs for solar PV, for example, the fuel costs for coal, any policy targets for renewables, how that intersects with energy storage investment decisions. So the other primary modeling tool is production cost modeling, which is depicted on the bottom half of this slide. And this enables us to dig into the details of system operations to understand which energy storage services are of the greatest value for the grid, how energy storage is operated when there's renewable energy curtailment or transmission congestion, and other questions about improved system operations in order to capture the full value of an energy storage system. Importantly, these models work together so that results of the planning model are reflected in the production cost modeling simulation and vice versa. So the tools really help us to overcome some of the key challenges to valuing energy storage services. Some of the challenges are highlighted on this slide. So first, the cost benefit of value stacking becomes more complex. And that's because when you have a single technology that's providing multiple services, it may exclude certain services at different times. So for example, an energy storage project that's providing ancillary services might be excluded from providing peaking capacity at the same time. So the different time frames for it that energy storage can operate on is also challenging from a modeling perspective. So energy storage project that provides daily energy arbitrage can also provide value for seasonal peaking capacity. So we need to reflect that in that complexity in our planning models. We can also consider how energy storage plays with other resources on the grid. And that's where the coordination becomes really important. Coordination between balancing areas, so between states, and also across country borders. So we need to understand how energy storage deployment in India will impact hydro operations in Nepal, for example. So, and finally, we also need to understand how energy storage services will evolve when we add complexity to the grid through uncertainty. So uncertainty in load growth, in renewable energy deployment, and also in the technology costs. Because as the shifting mix of technologies changes in the future, we'll see different services be valued. So we're developing some really exciting features in our modeling tools to deal with these unique challenges. We use the REEDS India model. So the REEDS India model is the Regional Energy Deployment System. It's an open access tool for mid and long-term capacity expansion planning. And we use it to find the mix of generation, transmission, and storage investments that will meet the needs of the future power system at least cost. And we're excited to introduce some really detailed treatment of energy storage in the REEDS India model. Some of the key features are listed here. So multiple durations of storage, valuing the capacity credit or the firm capacity contribution from energy storage technologies at different durations, understanding the energy arbitrage value of storage, understanding how operating reserves are valued and procured, understanding the value of reduced curtailment when storage is added. And then we're also adding a simplified hourly operations model that helps us better understand and represent the limitations of storage and state of charge management in the planning model. So the figures on the right show examples of the results that can be obtained. We look out 30 years to understand the trends and the trade-offs between energy storage investments and investments in conventional technology and in transmission. And we can also get insights about where wind and solar deployment will go hand in hand with storage and what types of storage will be cost effective in different regions. And also where it makes sense to pair storage with renewable energy investments and what durations and types of storage would result in a least cost system. So this next slide focuses on the production cost modeling or the operational simulation that gives us a really detailed representation of energy storage operations in the future system. So because we're using an integrated modeling approach, we're able to look at the operations for any year in our planning horizon out to 30 years into the future. So some of the key new features that we're implementing in this modeling compared to previous studies is that we're looking at detailed state of charge management for different energy storage technologies. We're using the market model simulation to assess the energy arbitrage value of storage in the operating time frame. We're understanding how storage can be provisioned for ancillary services and the trade-off between storage providing frequency response services, and energy services. And we're using scenario-based approach to value energy storage for transmission deferral and transmission network upgrade deferrals. We're also looking at how storage operates during periods when you have higher RE forecasts, for example, or sorry, a high RE forecast error. So we're also modeling not just India, but also Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh in an integrated operating environment, so that we're understanding the cross-border implications of increasing energy storage deployment. And we're using existing plans for energy storage growth in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. We're using different scenarios for those growth opportunities. And we're using different scenarios of the operations and the market interactions between the countries to represent the value of storage technologies across the region. So coming back to the original question in my first slide, what are the drivers for energy storage in South Asia, and how are we addressing that? So we're using a scenario-based approach. And that means that we're looking at the impacts of different, for example, costs. So in the top left, we look at the uncertainty and the technology cost in our planning horizon in the next 30 years. So we're going to identify global trends under different ways that costs will change over time. In the top right panel, we're looking at scenarios for different market rules. For example, one of the key scenarios we're looking at is whether energy storage will be allowed to monetize its contribution to resource adequacy. And we'll see the implication of that policy on the trend of energy storage growth. In the bottom right panel, this is depicting how we're using a scenario-based approach to understand the value of energy storage for transmission deferral and congestion relief. And in the bottom left panel, that's the last piece that I'll mention, is we're using a scenario-based analysis to understand the impacts of different operating practices. And that includes the ways that reserves are scheduled, the ways that system operators coordinate across state and country borders, and other operational practices that will impact the way that we can capture the full value of energy storage in system operation. So with that, I will turn it over back to David for some concluding remarks. Thanks, everyone, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ilya. So I just have a couple slides to wrap up here. And then we'll hopefully have a few questions that we'll be able to answer and seeing them come in. So thank you for those. Okay, so as we just covered, a couple of the key outcomes of this study would be a regulatory readiness assessment for the three countries that we mentioned, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Those will be coming out at different times. In the next couple months, you'll see one from India. So hopefully keep an eye out for that. And we would certainly appreciate any feedback on what we talked about today in terms of the readiness tool that Amy talked about. And as Ilya mentioned, we're building a lot of very complex models to understand the techno-economic drivers. Ultimately, we're not trying to forecast exactly what will happen in the future, but we want to understand what are the major drivers in the economy and in the power system for energy storage. And I think that will give us a good indication of the potential for energy storage in the future. So just a revisit to our timeline. In a couple months, we'll have a report out, and then you'll see something from us at the end of the year in terms of the techno-economics. And in summer 2021, we'll have more techno-economic analysis and readiness assessments for Bangladesh and Nepal. So I just quickly wanted to go over, what we're trying to provide in terms of what's the benefit to stakeholders. So we think this benefits a lot of stakeholders across the region, policymakers and regulators. Hopefully that's clear from our analysis that we're going to be doing on the regulatory environment, and hopefully providing some priority focus areas for development and data-driven insights on the role and opportunities for energy storage. And certainly we value the quantitative side of this in hoping that we can give some data-driven analysis that helps understand how things might change in the future and the impacts of decisions in the near term. For operators and planners, we expect to have a lot of outputs from both our planning and operations model that will provide some insights into how you can maximize the value of energy storage on the grid, different operational practices, and also feasible pathways for system development. So this is in the planning stages. Given different potential futures, what is the best way for energy storage to capture parts of the market? And some of these tools will be available for open access. One of them already is the READS model that Ilya talked about. It's an India-specific model, but it's a complex capacity expansion model, and so that's open access already. So if there's any researchers out there, please reach out to us, and we'd be happy to give you access to those planning tools. And for the private sector, ultimately there's investment opportunities that hopefully we shed some light on, but also understanding the risk factors and how certain policies that you might be thinking will be coming along, how those could impact the markets for energy storage. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I think turn it over to Mr. Batra. So thank you all for being here, and hopefully we have time for a few questions.
Thank you, David, and your team, Amy Rose, Ilya, and you have one more. That's I'm sorry. Could you?
Our colleague Mark Pitu is on from the State Department, and they are funding this work.
Okay. Right. So I think there is a specific question for Ilya, which I'll ask. There's just about 5 minutes left, I guess. So I'll ask this. I mean, this is specifically addressed to him, and then maybe we could take some questions up till the time we have, which is about 4 minutes. So Ilya, the question is for you is, do you model emergency/abnormal operating conditions and load flows?
Thanks. That's a good question. So we're not conducting load flow modeling, and we're not looking at emergency conditions. So that's out of the scope of our planning analysis because we are looking at such a long horizon, right? Up to 30 years into the future. So we're not focused on the kind of load flow modeling.
Okay, thank you. There was a question on the safety of lithium-ion batteries. That's a technology-specific question. So I don't know if you would like to answer that. Would you like to say and talk about that? Anyone? I mean, David or anyone, about the number of fires which were taking place in lithium-ion batteries in 2019. You have any comments on that? What's the causes for that?
So that's outside of the scope to look at all the safety standards that might be necessary. We are, as Amy mentioned, that is part of our regulatory analysis. Right. I don't know if she wants to add, but yeah, trying to understand specific technologies and potential safety issues is outside the scope.
Right. That's what I thought, but then I just thought that a lot of these questions are not directly related to the studies on the regulatory and policy issues for encouraging storage. But let me just tell the panelists, the attendees who've asked these questions, that policy normally, all these new technologies or forward-looking things start with policy, and then it goes on to regulations based on the policies. And of course, standards have to come by when you have these. Somebody asked about a standard for, or how do you measure the how much storage is remaining in a battery. So there's the brain of the battery, which is called the battery management system, which would indicate what is the level of battery, what is the level of charge which is remaining. There are no standards as yet in the IEC for these for the battery management system, but in India and the Bureau of Indian Standards, we've just taken out one standard on the battery management system, which states that the state of charge, the state of health, and a lot of things of battery should be given. So that would come out on the website of the Bureau of Indian Standards soon. There was a question about please talk about storage bundled with RE projects versus a distribution company ownership from operational and economic perspectives. Would you like to say anything on that, David?
Sure.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. The modeling we're using is sort of agnostic in choosing between whether storage is going to be bundled or not. We only have so much fidelity in terms of the geographic representation. So what we're looking at is a certain geographic area might have a lot of renewable energy. It might also have a lot of storage built in that area. So you could bundle that or not bundle it. There is some economic incentive to bundling, and you're seeing that a lot in the US, where there's certain decreases in the electronics that are needed for essentially the inverters, the cost of the inverters, and you can save money on those. We're not getting into the specifics of specific plants necessarily, so we kind of stay outside of bundling or not bundling, but certainly within our modeling framework, it's essentially the same thing.
Okay, right. Dr. Rose, let's take this as the last question, because I think we've completed the time, but Dr. Rose. I don't know where the question is gone. I'm sorry, it went off the screen. So what we'll do is, I think then, thanks everyone, David, Amy, Elia, and Mohit, for the presentation. A lot of people have asked whether this should be, it's come again. Does your energy storage readiness assessment for Nepal take into consideration? I think it's gone again.
Reservoir storage, actually, I see it.
Oh, you can see it. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So Amy, does it take into consideration? Yeah.
Sure. So the readiness assessment is, as David mentioned, technology agnostic. So the idea is to design the right rules in place that can enable whatever the appropriate solution is to be deployed and be compensated for providing services. So we don't distinguish between different technologies in that way.
Right. So the plain answer to that is that it's technology agnostic. It doesn't matter which storage you take into consideration. It's just talking about storage. I think we'll answer all the remaining questions, if there are. I think there are, by mail, or we'll put it on the website of SARI EI, as well as the presentation. David, can we share the presentation with everyone? Let us know.
Yes, you can. Yep.
Okay. And as well as, I think we are recording. Are we recording?
Yes, sir. It's recording.
Okay. Okay. So we can put on the recording also. So in case you've missed something, you can listen to that. Thank you very much. We had about 150 participants today. Thanks, David. Thanks, and your team from NREL. And thank you, my colleagues from IRADE, who helped to put this webinar together, but we'll be looking forward to the results of your studies at a later stage, as you said, which would be quite important, because economic analysis and things are things which really make things move. So optimization and economics are what every country looks for. There are a number of questions on that. We'll send you the questions for answering to what is in your scope. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone who attended this. We've got people from all around India, as well as South Asian nations, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, as well as people from abroad, from US, from Europe. Thanks very much, everyone, and I hope there was value addition to your attending this webinar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.